Hello and welcome to Mann's Model Moments. This video is the follow-up to the Doing It Better video I posted last week, which in turn was in answer to the 10 beginner mistakes video, both of which you can find linked above. Now in the last video I deliberately set aside covering the cockpit painting until this video so I can show you all the finishing steps together. I'm using the AK Interactive Early World War II Luftwaffe paint set as it has everything I need for the Falke, and I've heard good things of these paints. So to start with, I'm just giving an overall coat of RLM02 Grau to the primed cockpit. Before adding in a little ice yellow to lighten it a little without desaturating it, and then misting over again just to give some depth. I'm then going over the instrument panel and cowling with Vallejo matte black, and that's about it for the cockpit. Now obviously I need to remask the canopy and underside observation window after taking the photos from last time, which I did with Tamiya tape. Once done, I went on to paint the wheel wells, which again was with the RLM02 Grau. This was my first time using these 3rd generation AK acrylics, and I have to say they're pretty good, though they do need thinning for both airbrush and hand painting. I was reasonably careful, but cleaned up overspray using a tissue with some alcohol just to get back to primer for an even finish. After the wheel wells were dry, I filled them with tissue and then sealed them with masking fluid. I use artist masking fluid as it's less smelly and cheaper than products like Humbrol Maskol, but anything that will block off the painted wheel wells will do. Everything masked off appropriately, it's time to get to painting. I'm using the AK RLM65 through my airbrush as it's what I'm used to and it's fast, but you can hand paint or use spray cans if you prefer. I'll be making a video soon comparing all of these as well, as it's a common debate as to which is best. Once the first coat is on, I'm using my little pet hairdryer to speed up the drying process, and then I can go straight into a second coat to ensure I've got a good, even coverage on the model. Whilst I've got the paint in my airbrush, I'm painting the undercarriage doors too. I use little crocodile clips on wires to hold parts like this whilst painting. When the underside is properly dry, I usually wait overnight for this, it's time to mask all the underside parts. Once again, I'm using Tamiya tape for this and making sure it's all correct before moving on. It's better than trying to correct errors later. All masked up, it's time for the topside colours. I'm going to give an overall coat of the lighter colour, then mask over this and come back with the darker colour over that. Again, I'm using 2 coats here, drying in between with the dryer and leaving overnight before continuing. Early war German splinter camouflage is all angles and sharp edges, so masking is relatively easy, if time consuming. The benefit is that time spent masking saves time painting, and 2 coats of RLM70 go on quickly with the help of my noisy little friend here. The next step is one I really enjoy, and that is unmasking the model to see the fruits of our labours. The main thing to remember here is to be patient and not to damage the painted surface in your efforts to remove the tape. Before I carry on to decal application, I'm going to give the model a gloss coat. I'm using Pledge here, but any suitable gloss coat will do. Now obviously I had to replace the decals since I used the prior ones, and they were fragmented and horrible anyway. Sheets of national markings, as I'm using here, are not very expensive, but you can also make your own if you prefer. The actual decal application was painless, though a little fiddly as you can see here, and I sealed the decals in place with more pledge. Leaving the model to dry now is an ideal time to paint all the other ancillary pieces. Here you can see I'm painting the spinners, using thinned paint and taking care to try to keep off other areas. Even though the props will be black, it's good practice in brush control for when it matters more. You can see the primer gives a much better key for the paint than when I painted the bare plastic before, but even then I'm giving everything 2 thin coats. I'm doing the same thing with the props, and then moving on to the landing gear, again in RLM02 with a very dark grey for the tyres. One of the reasons I like using pledge as a gloss coat is that I can use oils directly on top. If you're using enamels or a solvent-based gloss, you need to cover with another acrylic coat or use acrylic washes here, otherwise you'll reactivate the coats below and make a horrible mess. In any case, what I'm doing here is using my homemade oil wash, you'll find out how to use those using the link to the video above, to highlight panel lines. I'm using a fine brush and taking care not to get the wash everywhere. This is a pin wash, not an overall one. For the undercarriage, I'm being less careful with an overall wash over the entire assembly. When the wash has dried for about 20 to 30 minutes, I go back to it with a cotton bud with just a hint of solvent on it and gently wipe away the excess. This should leave a subtle staining around the panel line with some of the pigment remaining in the line itself. The great thing about this is that it's very easy to control how much you leave or take off. More solvents on your cotton bud will remove more pigment. If you take too much off, you can always go through another application and repeat the process. Now I'm not going to use the number decals, and I don't have replacements, so I need another solution. What I'm going to do is create a mask using the decals, so the first point of order is to try to strengthen them as much as possible. Again, I'm using a coat of pledge here, but you can use any varnish you like. I'm using 22mm Tamiya tape for the mask and attaching it to a steel ruler here to give me a solid cutting surface. With that down, I have to get the decal onto the tape, which is harder than it should be, as even with the pledge to give it some strength, it's still fragmented. Nevertheless, with a lot of coaxing and teasing, I managed to do the mini jigsaw puzzle that it presented to me and get the decal onto the tape and then let it dry. With it now firmly in position, I could cut the tape using the decal as a guide with a sharp scalpel blade. The next step was to put the tape mask on the model, and then use that as a guide to hand paint the number using thinned acrylic. Now I wasn't using the mask here to flood the paint in because I don't want either paint creeping under the mask through capillary action, or for it to dry up against the tape and create a ridge of paint. Again, I'm taking my time and using 2 coats of thin paint to ensure good colour density and even coverage. When dry, I'm removing the mask very carefully to ensure I don't damage it as I need it for the other side. Now on the first video I hand painted the canopy, quite badly, and so I want to avoid doing that this time by using Decal film. Here I've sprayed some clear film with my top coat colour for the canopy, and then coated it in pledge. If you don't use a top coat over the paint, you'll find it can flake or break. The extra coat just helps prevent that and give it a bit more strength. What I'm doing here is measuring the width of the framing and cutting strips of the painted film to match, and then roughly measuring the lengths I need for the framing and cutting sections to a little bit longer than needed. With my Decal film framing prepared, I can now apply these just like any regular decal, using the kit canopy framing as a guide for placement. They can be adjusted until you're happy with them, and the excess trimmed off with a sharp blade. The beauty of this is that it gives a nice sharp edge regardless of your skill with a brush, without needing canopy masking. You can even paint the Decal film with your internal colour first, so you get a two-sided colour effect. As you can see here, I've superglued the undercarriage on now, and there's just the exhaust ducts to paint before weathering. I'm just picking these out with Vallejo Saddle Brown and a fine brush. I'm using a number of oil paints here to create some colour filters over the main paint finish. To do this, I'm just randomly spotting colours I've chosen over the airframe. This leaves us with a spotty plane, which of course we don't want. So then I'm using odourless thinners on a brush to just smush these spots around, diluting them and spreading them in random splotches. This creates little micro variations in tone and breaks up unrealistically smooth areas of colour, making it seem more natural to the eye. This is completely optional of course, and how much you apply depends on what sort of finish you're looking for. I'm going to overemphasise this step to demonstrate it for you, but I wouldn't normally apply this much to an aircraft even if it was very weather beaten, so please bear that in mind. Now the Jumo engine exhaust placement next to the underside of the wing meant that these surfaces got pretty dirty. I'm using homemade pigments, again, video for those above, to replicate that by loading a brush with them and just streaking it across the surface of the model. I think pastels work really well for this, and generally I use a mix of black and brown for exhaust staining. You can gradually build up the effects here, but how much you apply is really up to you. Just remember that this is a pretty messy step and the model will need sealing with varnish afterwards. As you can see, I'm putting on a fairly generous amount of staining here, which you may think is excessive, but again, check your sources, because the Falke was a dirty bird. Here's a period photo of the underside of one, showing just how much staining built up from those oily Jumos. Speaking of period photos, this is a lovely one showing the wear on the wing surface caused by the crew. I'm going to recreate this with a mixture of Vallejo oily steel and aluminium, thinned and carefully applied with a fine brush, with continual reference to the photo. Once I'm satisfied with the overall effect, I'm going back again with a slightly brighter mix into the centre of these areas, again just to create some visual interest and texture. A really obvious absent detail in the kit are the barrels for the MG17 machine guns in the sides of the fuselage. These were very prominent on the real aircraft and can be represented with rod or tube, but I happen to have these lovely Ares items kicking around that I secured in place with a spot of superglue. There's no pitot tube in the kit, so we need to add one here. I made a pilot mark with my scalpel, then drilled out a small hole in the nose. I then added a small drop of superglue and secured a long pin in place. When dry, I trimmed this to length with wire cutters. The last fiddly pieces are the radio masks, and the Falke had a really tall mask affixed to the observer's canopy, and I fixed that on with superglue. The tail mount was also absent on the kit, so I made a mark for it with a scalpel as before, drilled it out, and added a small brass pin, which was then cut down to size with the wire cutters again. Fishing line was then superglued between the two masks. And trimmed to size. The very last steps were to touch up where bare superglue was still present on the model, just covering with the appropriate paint where needed. The undercarriage doors were added, and we were done. So here's the finished model. I'm really glad I chose to remake this kit for the last two videos, because it gave me the incentive to make a model of an aircraft that I've always wanted to, but the barrier to do that was always the effort needed for the Karo kit. I do have another of these kits, so I still have the opportunity to do this again and work a little bit harder on the cockpit, replace the canopy and produce a more refined Falcon, but that was never the intent of this video. It was about showing you how you can improve your model making just using basic modelling skills. The finished model might not be to your taste, but I hope you can see I did address the points I raised in my first video. With that, let's see some before and after comparison shots. That's all for this instalment of Mann's Model Moments. If you enjoyed the video, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel for more like it, and share this video with others you think would also enjoy it. You can also follow me on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook, and if you're feeling generous then I also have a Patreon, which is absolutely the best way of helping me to grow the channel and produce more content like this. With that, I hope you have plenty of modelling moments of your own, and I look forward to welcoming you on the next video.